And what does this mean? What are you trying to do in a given city? How are you going to change
Yeah.
it to make it more of a village? What does that mean?
Yeah. So for instance, Portland, Oregon, which is where I live, is kind of the big petri dish where we're working and trying to, have this kind of impact that's measurable. So for instance, we have 95 neighborhoods without a single public square. And if a neighborhood is somewhat analogous to a village in scale, it should also be analogous to a village in terms of how people would actually have some relationship to each other and be able to, solve local problems, have creative expression, make the streets safer, engage their youth, and that sort of thing. So it happens that in those 95 neighborhoods, there's not a single public square, and that's typical of all American cities, because after all, we're all laid out according to the dictates of the National Land Ordinance of 1787, which basically, was designed to obscure any kind of resident or native placemaking patterns and replace them with a gigantic development grid that was really is a blueprint of Roman colonialism, which I think almost no one would imagine would be laid out to help people talk to each other and build community. So the form that our work takes in the nonprofit sector is we've created ordinances in the city of Portland that have been replicated in something more than 100 cities in North America that enable neighborhoods to literally walk out into an intersection and say, we'll now turn this into a public square. And they can do it for free, and they can do it as many street intersections as they want to all across their neighborhood. So it's literally taking community space that already exists, but has become dominated by cars in the last 100 years, and giving it back to the community so that it can start to play the functions that it used to play with a more cultural focus before cars came to dominate the landscape. So
What does that mean? Like, where would you put using empty lots, or how do you define where to put these things, how many, who will take care of them, et cetera?
yeah, so literally the surface of the street. So the right-of-way is quite a broad swath of space, and then it intersects in intersections that we've come to think are just car spaces. So that intersection, if you're in a typical city, it can be 60 feet wide from property line to property line, going across both sidewalks and, sidewalk on both sides, and then a kind of a median or a grass strip, and then the street in the middle. Those grass strips can be narrow, they can be wide, but the right-of-way is just this kind of big swath that exists by a declaration or an ordinance of the corporation of each town or city from the very beginning of the town. Well, so that used to be a multi-purpose space. And, as I said, lately, and as we all know, lately, since about 1920, that space has been dominated by cars. So what this literally means is that communities all over our city are going out and they're reconsidering that space. They have community dialogues. They sit down together. They talk about what they love about their community and also the problems that they're facing, which always includes isolation and a sense of powerlessness. So they start by talking about what they can directly do if they had access to that space in between their homes. So it's the idea that the street becomes a commons once again that brings people together. And so typically people will come up with a gigantic street mural and they'll fundraise for it in their own community, and then they'll install it all together. Because after all, every neighborhood across the land has this broad range of skills and talents, and everybody's got tools.
What are you installing?
Giant graphic. That's one thing. A giant graphic that goes down the street. So for instance, there's a neighborhood here called the Sunnyside neighborhood. So their logo is a sunflower, and they put down this giant Fibonacci geometry sunflower in the street that is so big that it actually unites all of the corners in this big luminous graphic. And then on the corners, they install things like interactive kiosks, solar-powered T-station. This is actually the context where the first Little Free Library and the first fleet of Little Free Libraries actually started back in the mid-90s. So places for exchanging, materials and goods and games, places for artistic inspiration, gardens, fruit trees, flowers. Basically, the idea is that the space becomes available for the agency of the community to be able to engage in a place where they can build their own infrastructure that reflects their ideas, and certainly becomes an amazing way of engaging children, getting them outside, getting them off the couch, getting them to do things, to build a civic sensibility. So it's quite an exuberant result that inspires.
So they put a graphic on the street on an intersection, but then what? I mean, does that encourage people to hang out in the intersection? Do they put barriers to cars? Like, do they put a roundabout? I mean, what happens?
Well, a roundabout would tend to divide the space. So that kind of infrastructure is usually not part of what we're talking about. But things like curb extensions on the streets do help to provide more pedestrian space. But the immediate impact is that drivers notice that they're in a place that is different and that is more about, community and pedestrians and children. So their behavior changes as they approach. Normally when it comes to traffic calming, you're talking about displacing cars vertically or horizontally in order to go slower. So to go around something or to go over a speed bump, to force them to slow down. But when it comes to placemaking, as basically a new driver awareness program, it has a market impact on their sense that this space that they're coming into is different than all the other spaces where there isn't creativity and these interesting features to pay attention to.